Welcome everyone to the latest episode of What Economists Really Do, which is an outreach program from the University of Oxford. The goal of the series is to highlight how economic research can help us understand some of the most pressing challenges facing society today. My name is Ralph Ossa, and I'm delighted to be the guest moderator of this episode today. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Zurich, and I'm also currently the chief economist of the World Trade Organization. And let me note right at the outset that the views I expressed today are, of course, my own and do not necessarily reflect those of WTO members or the WTO Secretariat. The focus of today's episode is on the political economy of trade policy, and we are fortunate to have Paola Conconi as our speaker. Paola is a professor of economics at the University of Oxford and a professorial fellow at New College, Oxford. She has an outstanding publication record in leading economics journals and is currently leading a major research project on trade agreements and supply chains funded by an advanced grant from the European Research Council. We have planned for you today the following sequence of events. Paola will start with a 30-minute keynote presentation. Then I will provide a 10-minute reaction. After that, I will ask Paola a couple of questions, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A. And overall, the event will last for 1 hour. So with that, let us dive right in. Paola, over to you.
So fantastic. First of all, thanks a lot to Ralph for agreeing to host, to be the guest moderator. It's really an honor, and I'm looking forward to our bilateral discussion after my presentation. So I have 30 minutes to go over a lot of stuff. So let me indeed go straight in. So let me just put the old slide up. So if I think about the last 30 years, exactly 1995 was the year the WTO was created. And in these 30 years since then, a lot of good things have happened in terms of trade liberalization and reduction in trade barriers. So not only was the WTO created, but the WTO expanded with new members like China joining a few years later. Also, through the Uruguay round negotiation and the implementation of the tariff cuts that were agreed upon in the Uruguay round, the tariffs, the so-called MFN tariffs, the multilateral tariffs, have been going down further. And on top of that, there's been a lot of action in terms of regional or bilateral trade agreements that have further reduced trade barriers among groups of countries. So all of these is good news, and this has been accompanied by a big expansion in world trade. At the same time, if you look at the same period, the last 3 decades, there's already been a lot of action in terms of trade protection. So we have seen throughout, and we'll talk about it more later, widespread use of so-called temporary trade barriers in the form of mostly anti-dumping duties, but also safeguards and countervailing duties. These are things that were in the toolkit that the WTO allows for governments to use. But then there have been more recently special tariffs that have been used that are not supposed to be used. They go against multilateral trade rules. And again, we'll talk more about them. On top of these tariffs, there are also non-tariff barriers that are widespread in trade agreements. And not only, if you think about trade agreements like free trade agreements, rules of origin, for example, are very murky kinds of trade protection, or product standards, or other kind of non-tariff barriers. So there has been a lot of action, both in terms of liberalization and in terms of protection. And what I'm going to try to do in these 30 minutes is to review a little bit my work that addresses the question of what are the political factors that explain this push on one hand for trade liberalization and also push for protection on the other hand in some policies. So there's really a lot of action when it comes to trade policy, and we want to try to understand what are the political drivers behind these policies that we observe. So I'm going to focus on 2 projects, those that are in bold, because they cover 2 aspects, 2 types of determinants. One is lobbying by special interest, and the other one is electoral incentives of politicians. So I'm going to focus first on the project that is now recently published, and then I'm going to talk about this ongoing project. So the first project is focused on one of the trade liberalization trends we have been mentioning, which is the surge in regional trade agreements. So if we look at the early 90s, before the WTO was created, in the early 90s, there were trade agreements, regional trade agreements in force. Think about already, for example, the EU, not called the EU at the time, but was already there before it expanded, but there were much fewer. And then there's been a big surge. There are now more than 370 agreements in force, and many more are being negotiated. Think about, for example, EU-Mercosur has already been finalized, it's not yet into force, but there are many more that are being negotiated. So there's been a lot of action for the removal of trade barriers in the form mostly of free trade agreements and to a less extent customs union. What Danny Roderick has argued in an article on the Journal of Economic Literature is that when we look at the political economy of these trade agreements, rather than being dominated by protectionist interests, it is dominated by the self-interest behavior on the export side of large politically connected firms. And so when we think about this view of a push of firms in favor of trade liberalization, this seems to be at odds with the traditional view that is, elegantly capturing the Grossman-Hellman protection for sale model that sees any trade liberalization effort being, met with a lot of strong opposition. In reality, I think this view, and for example, the Grossman-Hellman model is based on a particular kind of trade policy that is unilateral and sector-specific. So in that framework, it is indeed in the interest of firms, if a firm is presented with a policy that is, liberalization, say, in your own sector, and it's unilateral, this is only going to hurt firms in that sector. We're going to face an increase in import competition. So it makes sense for firms in import competing sector to oppose such measure. But if we think about trade agreements, in particular free trade agreements, the politics, the economics is different, the politics is therefore different, in that free trade agreements are not unilateral, they're reciprocal. So if, for example, the United States negotiates a free trade agreement with Korea, it's not just the United States that is liberalizing, but Korea is doing the same, which of course means that for firms, although you do see an increase in import competition in your final goods, you also have that the other country removes barriers for your final goods, so you can improve access to foreign customers. And that's one of the sources of gain. On top of it, since free trade agreements cover all sectors, not just, they're not sector specific, then it means that firms have additional sources of gains to the extent that their source inputs from foreign suppliers, they can actually get access to cheaper inputs. So, but this is not his only type of gains that accrue to firms that are internationalized. They're already, if you want, selecting into trade, into exporting and importing. And so you would expect indeed large firms to be the firms that are pushing for this type of policies in line with Danny Roderick's argument. So what we do in this project is, first of all, to collect new data that I'm going to describe to you in a couple of slides, in which we really look at lobbying on free trade agreements and in a very systematic way. So the Lobbying Disclosure Act in the United States has made it possible to really study lobbying on specific policy issues, and here we focus on free trade agreements. With this new data set, we then uncover a series of facts, novel facts, that actually echo very much Roderick's argument. So what do we find? The key fact that it's quite striking, as you'll see, is that the lobbying on free trade agreement is dominated by large multinational firms, and all these firms are overwhelmingly, but in virtually all cases, lobbying in favor of these agreements. So this is very much in line, again, with Roderick's argument, but it cannot really be explained by traditional models of political economy of trade, which don't feature firm heterogeneity and selection into lobbying. So what we do next, and I'm only going to mention just the key features of our model, is to develop a model of endogenous lobbying on trade agreements by heterogeneous firms that can rationalize our empirical findings. So let me start from the data. This is data that I use in several projects, and it's really rich. So if you look at the early data on political economy or trade, when the first studies were written, like the AER, Goldberg-Maggi, this was a very influential study that was using the data available at the time, which was data on campaign contributions. Since then, since 1995, the Lobbying Disclosure Act has passed, and this allows researchers to really look at detailed information about lobbying, much more detail, in fact, than campaign contributions. So there are two main advantages of using data on lobbying expenditures through the Lobbying Disclosure Act. The first and most important is that you can really look at issues targeted by the lobbyist. So think about a firm offering campaign contribution to a politician. You don't know whether the campaign contribution are to influence trade policy as compared to, I don't know, immigration policy or other policies. And even within trade policy, you wouldn't know if what the firm is doing is trying to affect, say, anti-dumping duties or free trade agreements. Policies are very, very different. What the advantage of using information from lobbying reports available through the Lobbying Disclosure Act is, as you will see in a couple of slides, you can really look at the specific issues targeted by the lobbies. The second advantage is that in terms of magnitude, if you look at lobbying expenditures, total on all issues, and total campaign contributions, lobbying expenditures are really the main challenge, the main channel, of pressure. So they account for much more spending than spending on campaign contributions. So what the Lobbying Disclosure Act does is requiring any individual or organization, including firms, but also unions, industry associations, to file semi-annual reports providing detailed information on the lobbying activities, and there are significant penalties for violations of its requirements. So what you have since 2008 in particular, it's every quarter firms or other organizations have to file these detailed reports. In the next slide, I have an example, but what is already, so we collect all the reports that are related to the ratification of free trade agreements. That's our main data set. We also collect reports that are just linked to free trade agreements in the US, not necessarily the ratification, even the earlier phase. But our main data set is focused on the ratification bill. So lobbying that takes place when there was already an agreement in place, it's been negotiated, and now the question is, will it be ratified? And when you look at lobbying on free trade agreements, one of the things that is immediately striking is that not industry associations, which are what we often think in the old theory of political economy of trade, we often think of industries being active. But what you see is that the key players are not industries, but individual firms. They spend more than 10 times as much as industry association, and much more, 60 times, almost more than the other players, which are the unions. So individual firms are the key players, and these actually makes sense, because if you think about industries, I don't know, like textile, within an industry like textile, there will be very heterogeneous type of firms, say a big multinational company like Nike, and also in textile and apparel, you will have a lot of small firms. And the interests of these firms will be different, because Nike will be involved in exporting, importing as foreign subsidiaries, and smaller firms in the same sector will not. And so, again, what you see is that there is actually lobbying by individual firms. And so the focus of today's presentation is on lobbying by firms, individual firms, which are really the key players. So what we do is then look at how much firms spend on lobbying on free trade agreements. And more importantly, we quote the position of the lobbying. So whether the lobbying is in favor of ratification of the entry into force or against it. And we do so mostly by looking at information provided in the lobby reports themselves, or if when this is missing, we look at official company statements. So let me give you an example, as I promised. So this is an example of one of the many lobbying reports in our data set. So this is a report filed by Philip Morris International in 2008, in the third quarter. And so here you have the company information. Here you have the amount spent lobbying in that quarter, which is just over $1 million. And then in section 15, 16, you have the specific, you have first the general lobbying issue, which is TRD, trade. And then within this general lobbying issue, you are asked to provide information on the specific issues. And here is where you see that the company, Philip Morris, mentions that he lobbies to implement the US-Colombia Trade Promotion Agreement. This is the free trade agreement between the US and Colombia, which was up for ratification. And so there's many more examples, but basically we code then the direction. So this is a company that is saying, both in the report and in company statement, that it lobbies to implement this bill, the entire bill. This is an example, but we basically collect for all reports that we are about lobbying by firms on free trade agreements. We code the position of the lobbying in favor or against. And as I mentioned before, the most striking fact that comes out from our data set is this fact one, which is virtually all firms that do lobby in favor. So this is the opposite of what the logic of protection for sale we've been thinking of. We would expect a lot of opposition. In reality, you see overwhelming support among firms that lobby. Notice that the firms that lobby are very few and large. So that's the next step. When you look at the firms that are actually selecting into lobbying on free trade agreements, even if you don't run any regression, you just plot the distribution of here sales or employment, you see the lobbying firms are larger than non-lobbying firms, and you can run regressions and see that the probability that a firm lobbies on free trade agreement increases significantly with size and multinational ownership. So the second fact is that the firms that select into lobbying and they overwhelmingly lobby in favor are firms that are large and are very likely to be multinationals. And then we look at the intensive margin. So we look at not just whether you lobby or not. As I said, all firms that lobby, 99% of them lobbying in favor. So the extensive margin is very strikingly telling a story in line with Roderick's story, which is the politics of free trade agreement is dominated by large multinational firms that push on the export side, as you were saying. So they push for these agreements to be implemented. By the way, I haven't mentioned, but this fact one is extremely robust. So you can look at keywords rather than ratification bill numbers to collect data on lobbying on free trade agreements. And even if you do keywords, which allows you to include agreements that never got up for ratification, like TPP. So we try to kill the fact in many ways, but it's extremely robust. Around 98, 99% of lobbying firms lobbying in favor. So the most striking facts are on the extensive margin, but then we look at the intensive margin. So how much firms that lobby and always lobbying in favor, how much they spend lobbying on different trade agreements. And what you see is that the lobbying effort, measured either in expenditure or number of reports filed, increases with how much the firms have to gain from a particular trade agreement. And we can measure these by looking at the combination of tariffs and the sector in which a firm is. So if you are like Philip Morris, we know your sector, we know the tariffs that are relevant for you, both on your final good and on your inputs, and we can look at by how much access to foreign consumers and foreign suppliers will be affected, and how much your competition in the domestic market in your final goods will be affected. And so the higher are, the larger are the gains, the more the firm spends, and the more is the increase in import competition, the less the firm spends. So these are, as you would expect, this is less striking and surprising, but firms put more effort when they stand to gain more. And the other thing that comes out is that firms put more effort when they're on pushing for the ratification of this free trade agreement, when they expect more political opposition in Congress. And we measure these in different ways, divided government or share of protectionist legislature. So the more firms think that they need to fight for this agreement to go through because there's more likely to be opposition to the agreement in Congress, the more they spend to push it through. So these are the main findings. And as I mentioned before, when we we looked at the data and we uncovered these findings, we couldn't take from the shelf a model that could explain them, because there's been some work to put firms into political economy or trade, but these were not heterogeneous firms. So what we do in what you need to explain our findings is, first of all, to build on the literature on firm heterogeneity of trade that was started by Mark Mellitz and as of course has now become really large. That basically shows that firms, even within narrowly defined sectors, are extremely heterogeneous and select into the various margins of trade. And so we have a model in which indeed there's firm heterogeneity and selection into trade. And what you have in that model is that a free trade agreement that removes reciprocally tariffs between two countries generates winners and losers. And what you can show is that the biggest winners are the most profitable firms that are gaining both in terms of access to foreign consumers and suppliers, and the gains, their stakes in terms of the absolute size of their gains is larger than the absolute size of the losses. So the biggest losers would be against, but are obviously against, they are hurt by the agreement, but their stakes are smaller in absolute terms than the biggest winners. And what this leads, once you combine these distributional effects of the FTA that come out of this model of firm heterogeneity a la Mellitz, with the political structure in which you also have selection into lobbying, what you have is that it's only the largest firms, the internationalized firms that stand to gain from these trade agreements that are selecting into lobbying. And so this is a model that basically explains not only this pie chart that I showed you before, fact one, that is overwhelmingly blue, meaning most firms that are selecting into lobbying on free trade agreements are in favor, but also the model explains the stylized effects on the intensive margin, including the fact that firms may be spending more when there's more uncertainty about the political support for these agreements. So this is a project that is finalized. We have an ongoing follow-up project with the same co-authors plus a couple of more, that is looking at trade agreements not just as eliminating tariffs, which is what we have done in the first project, but looking at trade agreement as including also encompassing a lot of deep trade provisions like intellectual property rights, product standards, investment rules that are also affecting firms' profits. So what we do is, again, with the same kind of methodology. So we look at all reports that are related to these deep trade policies. There are 17 non-trade policy issues according to the World Bank. So we use that category. We use text analysis on the lobbying reports to look at all reports related to IPRs, investment product standards, all these various non-tariff deep trade policy issues. And we then, again, construct a data set on lobbying on these deep trade policy issues, both domestic policies, like there are many policies, bills, domestic bills in the United States that would be deep trade policies, unilateral domestic ones. And of course, you have lobbying on deep trade policies within trade agreements, like in the, for example, CETA or TTIP. A lot of agreements contained a lot of provisions related to investment provisions, IPR, product standards. So one of the things that, if you look at the debate, and Ralph knows very well because he has worked on these, so there's a very lively debate on the role of corporations, large corporations, in shaping these deep trade policies. In fact, in Brussels, where I was for many years, there was a lot of opposition, for example, to the Canada-EU trade agreement, CETA, and to the TTIP agreement that then failed with the US, partly because there was a perception that a lot of these deep trade policies included in these trade agreements had been pushed by large corporations that they push for their own interest. So what we do show is that indeed large corporations, in fact, multinationals that are both domestic and foreign, are shaping these politics. And what we do is then provide a new theoretical model that looks as a new key feature compared to two key features compared to the existing literature on deep trade agreements and lobbying on deep trade agreements, which is to incorporate large firms, multinational firms, which have been absent from the literature, and allow for cross-border lobbying. So the possibility of firms to lobby in other jurisdictions. Because what you do see in the data is companies like Samsung lobbying from its US subsidiaries, or Novartis or Bayer. So these are large companies that have a presence in the US and have a voice in the US through the lobbying process. So let me move, since I'm aware of the time, to a second topic. So as I said, I think there is a large literature that focuses on lobbying as the key political pressure on trade policy. So we know the lobbying matters. And what I hope to have shown you is that it's not always in the way you expect. What maybe is less clear was, it wasn't, for a long time, there was a presumption that because trade policy is not salient enough for voters, it's all about lobbying. Elections don't matter. In reality, anecdotal evidence abounds. Here I put some evidence of politicians who have clearly made policy choice influenced by elections and electoral calendars. Let me just mention maybe a couple. So since we have Ralph from the WTO, Obama, just before his re-election in 2012, filed a complaint against China, the WTO, in which the complaint was that China had unfairly subsidized car parts. So as this article from The Economist pointed out, this was a very suspicious timing, filing the dispute just before re-election, because it was well known throughout Obama's first term that China had been subsidizing car parts. So why doing it just before elections? And on top of it, it did so. It announced this filing of the disputes in Ohio, which was at the time expected to be a swing state, and which was a key producer of car parts. So this was suspicious, and there's many more examples, and I can show you, there's in some of my other work that I'm not going to mention, we provide systematic evidence for the protectionist role of electoral incentive, and in particular, close to elections, politicians tend to be more protectionist. What I'm going to tell you today is about this ongoing project that exploits another feature, US institutional feature, linked to the election of the US president, and that is the Electoral College. So as probably many of you know, in the US, citizens don't directly elect the president, but they vote for presidential candidates in their state, and in each state, whoever wins the majority of votes gets all the electors who then vote for the president. So this electoral college system creates, it is well known, incentive to target swing states. So there is this there's this seminal paper by David Stromberg on the AER, which shows that during their campaigns, presidential candidates spend more time and money in swing states, in states expected to be very close, and with the vote margin is expected to be very close, because in these states you can, a few votes can swing all electors from one candidate to the other. So what we know less about, and what I'm going to show you some evidence of, is that there's also, swing state politics doesn't only affect campaigns, but affects actual trade policies. And in particular, we know there's like famous examples that I mentioned here of US presidents manipulating temporary trade barriers to favor particular industries that are important in states expected to be swing. So these are a couple of examples from the first term of George W. Bush, who introduced safeguards and anti-dumping duties against China, but in the industries where steel, which was of course very important for Ohio and Pennsylvania, which were expected to be swing in the next election, and also furniture from China. And again, this New York Times article was saying, surprise, surprise, they go after furniture because this is important for Wisconsin, and Wisconsin was at the time expected to be swing. And of course, the concern and what we are looking at in this project is to is to look at the effects of this politically motivated protection. So what we do, and this is a project with Chad Bown and Axel Erbacher and Lorenzo Trimarchi, so we put together, first of all, a data set that contains all protectionist measures, and in particular, all temporary trade barriers that the US has put in place since the 1980s. And we combine this data with the input-output data, again, detailed input-output data from the BEA that allows us to look at vertical linkages, input-output linkages between different industries to look at the effects of trade protection along supply chain. So if, say, steel is protected, which other industry are going to be affected, say car or construction, that use steel as an input. So in our analysis, we focus on measures against China. We may discuss this later with Ralph, but what you see is that China is by far the biggest target of US trade protection. And this is not only true since Trump's first term, it has been true for a long time. In fact, since China joined the WTO, around 75% of the measures are against China. So we focus on China, and we exploit arguably exogenous variation in the identity of swing states across electoral terms to identify the distributional effects of politically motivated trade protection. So let me explain you the key idea. So this is a map. This is a figure that shows you for the period 88-2020. So these are all the presidential elections in the last few decades. And this is what you see in pink are the states that are classified as swing based on one of our definitions, which is if the vote margin between the two presidential candidates in the election was less than 5%. So this was an error. So it means that whoever won, didn't get more than 52.5% of the votes. So this is a competitive election. We can change the threshold. We can also use polls data. But what I wanted to notice is that both the number and identity of swing states varies across these elections, which also means that if you are a president, an incumbent president, and you're facing re-election and you want to understand which states you want to target, which ones are the politically salient or swing states, you can, these are going to vary over time. So what we do, so this sort of, we first of all get this in the jargon of IV, instrumental variable strategy. We're going to have shifters, which are going to be political shocks that change the identity of swing states across terms. And then the shares, so which industries are going to be important in these states is going to depend on the initial employment share. So if, for example, Ohio is swing, which is not here, but in several terms. So if Ohio is swing, then we're going to look at which industries are important in Ohio, look at the initial employment share. So this is going to give us time-varying political importance of an industry. So it captures these variables. Swing industry JT is a variable that captures the importance of a SIG4 industry. So this is quite disaggregated during a term T, an electoral term T. So if you're looking at, for example, the period 88-92, this is a term of a president. It was George Bush Sr. So then you can measure the importance of industry in swing states or in states expected to be swing at the time. And in our main definition, we use previous presidential election to determine which states are expected to be swing, and we do robustness. While doing so, we find that, as expected, swing state politics matter. But what is really interesting is that it matters only in first terms when presidents are up for re-election. In second terms, there's no swing state politics. Safeguards, anti-dumping, countervailing duties do not respond to swing state politics. So it's only when the president faces re-election motives. And then we use this instrumental variable strategy to look at the effects of trade protection. So what we find is that if you look at the effects of politically motivated trade protection, again, exploiting this instrumental variable strategy to identify the effects, we find that, as you would expect, the protected sectors gain. So you have higher employment growth in sectors that get politically protected in a term because they are important in states expected to be swing. And however, you have the sectors that are downstream, so that they use protected goods as inputs, suffer in terms of lower employment growth. And in fact, the employment losses in the entire economy, or even if you just restrict the analysis to manufacturing, downstream sectors lose more in terms of employment, in terms of jobs, than the protected sectors gain. And when we also look at mechanism, we find that these effects and these employment effects are driven by, as you would expect, a reduction of inputs in the targeted protected industry and an increase in prices in those industries, which then results in an increase in input prices for downstream industries. So overall, this is showing you, first, the first part of the paper shows you that swing state politics, so electoral incentives matter, and in particular, presidents who are up for re-election manipulate these temporary trade barriers for electoral purposes, and that these politically motivated trade protection has real effects along supply chain. So it helps some industries, but has negative effects, repercussions that propagate to other industries that are not politically important at a given time. So let me finish. These are my broad takeaways. I think if I look at not just these two projects, but my agenda on political economy of trade, I think we see the lobbying matters a lot, and in particular, maybe surprisingly, if you look at different policies, trade agreements, deep trade agreement or deep trade policies, lobbying on anti-dumping duties, which I didn't tell you about, but multinationals are, and large firms, and in particular multinationals, dominate all types of lobbying. And the other thing that comes out is that electoral incentives also matter, but not all voters count the same. And there's clearly a protectionist bias. There's also a recency bias. Politicians respond to protectionist interests closer to election. And there's also a swing state bias, which I was just telling you about. So let me stop here. Maybe let me just say one word, since we have Ralph, and I want to discuss this with Ralph. So in this last minute, I want to pose and ask a second question, which is more for Ralph than I answer. But what I see is that if we look at the entire post-World War II period, we have had this unprecedented really increase in trade and economic growth, and partly because of the GATT WTO, which has created a rule-based international trade system that has really fostered both trade and economic growth. However, today, this system is threatened, and we see geopolitical tensions among key members. We see a lot of use of rules or measures that are prohibited by multilateral rules. And we also have a dispute settlement system, which is now paralyzed for reasons that we can discuss maybe with Ralph. But so for me, the key question is, can we save the system? Or will we revert to the beggar thy neighbor policies of the 1930s, when the US introduced the smooth-only tariffs, which then led to retaliation and trade wars all over? Or can we try to save the system? And I think an interesting maybe question that we can debate if we have time is, what role can be played by multinational corporations? As I showed you, and we can talk more, these companies are really important in the politics. And and they have a stake in keeping borders open. So for example, there's evidence that the turnaround on Trump's tariffs or against China and, against Mexico and Canada was partly due to heavy lobbying by multinationals, US multinationals who have subsidiaries in Mexico and Canada, and were clearly pushing against those measures. So can multinational be the police or the enforcer of the system? This is a provocative question, which I'm going to leave for debate with Ralph and the audience.
And thank you very, very much, Paola, for this excellent presentation. So what I thought I'd do now is I share a few thoughts on the presentation, but more generally on how I guess I see the context in which some of the things that you have explained fall. And then we can discuss a little bit. I have some questions for you, which are related, I guess, to the questions you have for me. And I also see that the audience has some questions. So let me talk a little bit about how I see the state of international trade and also how I see the state of the WTO, and then perhaps also a little bit on the current situation that we are facing. So if I start with the state of international trade, Paola, you mentioned that these are difficult times for international trade. And in my view, so if you ask me why are we in this crisis? Why do we have these trade tensions? In my view, this is fundamentally because people increasingly perceive trade as part of the problem when it comes to addressing some of the key challenges that we face today. And in particular, I'm thinking of three core challenges, which is to maintain peace and security, which is to reduce poverty and inequality, and also to achieve a sustainable economy. So I think if we want to kind of counter this narrative and also highlight the benefits of open trade, we not only have to talk about the traditional gains from trade that are often emphasized in the academic literature, but we also have to make the case, or at least try to understand under what circumstances international trade can actually be part of the solution and can actually be supportive in making our world more generally more secure, more inclusive, and more sustainable. And this is something that we've been working on here at the WTO now for quite some time, if you will. It's the guiding principle of our research agenda. And of course, in my few minutes here, I can't go into details, but just to give you one example, think about trade and sustainability. Most people, when they think of trade, they think of transport. When they think of transport, they think of transport emissions. So immediately you come to the conclusion trade is part of the problem. What we show, though, is that really trade is part of the solution, at least if supportive climate policies are in place. And the idea here is the idea of environmental comparative advantage. So we all know that there's economic gains from trade, and the economic gains from trade come from countries specializing in what they're relatively good at. By the same token, there's also environmental gains from trade, which come from countries specializing in what they're relatively green at. The key difference, though, is that these environmental gains from trade need to be activated by some climate policies, which in textbook economics would be a carbon price, for example. And we have some work showing that this is quantitatively important. But we can make similar arguments also for trade and security, for trade and inclusiveness. So that's the first point I wanted to make, that I think trade is really a part of the solution. But if I think about the globalization crisis here more broadly, I think it's also important to say that even though we are clearly at a crossroads, and I think it could go one way or the other, it's also important to emphasize that we do not see any deglobalization yet. The trade to GDP ratio has been relatively stable since the global financial crisis. So it's not that we are not facing difficult times, but it's also, I think, important to keep this in perspective. Mm-hmm. Now, about the state of the WTO, let me reflect on that a little bit. And here, the main thing I want to say is that it, for all its struggles and for all its need for reform, it does remain one of the most significant achievements of the international community, and it also continues to shape global trade. You showed this graph at the beginning with the explosion of regional trade agreements, of preferential trade agreements, and this is really important, and you see this a lot in the literature, but you might be misled from looking at this graph that this somehow means that multilateral trade policy making has become less important. And this is just not the case. Our statisticians here just calculated that still, despite everything that's going on, more than 80% of global trade still takes place under the WTO negotiated MFN tariffs, more than 80%, despite this proliferation of preferential trade agreements. And of course, there's some overlap. So there's some MFN tariffs that are zero, which are then also zero in free trade agreements. I think that's important to emphasize. It's also important to emphasize that the WTO continues to fulfill its core functions, which are to negotiate trade agreements, to implement trade agreements, and to settle disputes. Now, you mentioned, and I think this was also one of your questions, you mentioned that the dispute settlement system is not working at the moment. And of course, I'd be the first to admit, and all, most of our members, I think, would also share this perspective that we need to overcome this impasse on dispute settlement. But still, I wanted to just share that it's not that nothing is working. So it's a two-stage system. At the first stage, the panel stage is still working. And also many of our members have found a plurilateral workaround. There's something called the multi-party interim arbitration arrangement that the European Union and China, for example, are party to, which at least allows members who want to find a temporary solution to also have one. And if you think about the kind of current situation, I think something to keep in mind also is that the WTO is about much more than tariffs. And I think this is also where a lot of your political economy thinking is going to come into play in practice. And just to highlight two issues. So the first issue I wanted to highlight is services trade, and in particular, the General Agreement on Trade and Services. Services trade is highly dynamic. We think services trade is the future of international trade, in particular trade in so-called digitally delivered services, so anything that you can sell over the internet, essentially. And here, I mean, there's many countries that are successful services trader, but if you look at the US, for example, it's the world's largest services exporter with a market share of 13%. Another agreement that comes to mind where I'm sure business interests will also play an important role is the TRIPS agreement when it comes to intellectual property rights protection, also not something that you directly talked about, but it's clearly related. Strong intellectual property rights are essential for innovation and growth. And again, the United States is the largest intellectual property exporter with a market share of 28%. So so this all kind of makes me hopeful. Well, first that perhaps the system is not in bad condition as one might think when reading the newspaper, but also makes me think that there should be sufficient incentives, hopefully, also to underpin it going forward. And then, the elephant in the room, of course, how do we respond to rising trade tensions? And here, I think our Director General keeps sending a very clear message, which is that, yes, these are challenging times for global trade, but still we need a calm and pragmatic approach with open dialogue. And we've also seen that working in the past few weeks. From our perspective here, the priority has to be to prevent an escalation of trade tensions, to contain the spread of trade tensions, but also trade policy uncertainty. And again, for this, I think it's really important to keep things in perspective. I think also in your papers, you focus a lot on US data. And of course, we're thinking a lot about US-China trade tensions also. But just to give you one number, US-China trade accounts for less than 3% of world merchandise trade, which doesn't mean it's not important. Of course, it's very important, but the rest of the world is also quite large. So let me maybe stop here because we also want to have some time for questions. I also wanted to talk a little bit about what economists do at the WTO, but maybe we have time in the Q&A. Let me maybe pose a question to you, and it actually overlaps with some of the questions that I've seen in the chat. Well, actually, let me ask you a different question first. So as you said, I've also worked on tariff wars in the past. This was a little bit more over 10 years ago, and when I presented my paper back then, consensus view was, well, it's kind of an interesting paper, but it's really an exercise in economic history. We're never going to see an escalation of tariff tensions again, because we've been there in the 1930s. We've learned our lessons. And the future of trade policy is really deep integration, exactly what you discussed, which then also led me down, and I believe that too, so also led me down a path of studying deep integration agreements. Yet here we are again with tariffs being in the news. So I just wanted to ask you, what your sense is, what happened, and whether perhaps your political economy story can explain this.
So let me reshare my screen 1 second, because I want to. So I know that there is the impression that tariffs have reappeared. There is this famous QJE paper, The Return to Protection. But here I prepared a slide for you because, there is this perception what happened, the tariffs have all of a sudden appear with, in recent years, say, with Trump's first term. But in fact, in particular, when it comes to China, there's been a lot of use. Tariffs were there before. If you look in particular at temporary trade barriers and anti-dumping, most clearly, these are just the number of measures against China, but this is just the duty level. So you see this clear well before Trump. Trump is this red segment, but well before Trump, there's been an increase in protection, mostly against China, and mostly through anti-dumping duties. I think this is partly, let me go back to us and I can stop sharing. So I think what has happened, so tariffs were always used, but there were these special TTBs that governments had in their toolkit to combat, unfair trade, in the form of anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties, and sometimes you had safeguards, not for unfair trade, but, if you had these surges of imports. And so these were used widely. But so you had MFN tariffs, which were going down and were covering most of trade. And then you had a very extensive use of these measures. There's been a lot of work by Tom Prusa, Bruce Blauning, and Chad Bown, Michael Otto has done a lot of work. So these tariffs were used, and they were responding, by the way, to terms of trade motives. So it's not that we had no tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
They were part of the toolkit, and they were agreed upon. In the Uruguay round, you have the agreement on these measures. So what has happened, in my view, is that these are no longer enough, partly to counteract what was felt as too big of an unfair competition in the form of, at least from the point of view of the US, which was the country that got out of the system in a way, or started challenging a bit the system, was this is not enough. We cannot just use this toolkit. We need to use special tariffs because we have a new member, a member that has joined that is a very, very big player and is not a proper market economy. So there's subsidies, and I think it's really created problems because, again, there was a lot of use of anti-dumping, but also the appellate body would say, no, but you cannot use anti-dumping that way with these particular procedures. So I think there was really a frustration in the kind of trade defense instruments that member state could use. And I think this has created problems and has led then Trump in the first term to start using special tariffs outside the agreed upon toolkit. And then this leads to retaliation, and other countries say, but if they're not following the rules, neither am I. So I think this is how I see it. And yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very, very interesting perspective. So not really a clear break in a trend, but more something that's been brewing for a long time and is now just getting bigger. Which then leads me to my second question, which also is a question that an audience member asks in some slightly different words. But you talked a lot in your presentation about the trade promoting effect of business interests, basically that they're not just protectionist interests, but they're also trade promoting or pro-trade, let's say. So the question, I suppose, then is how do you see this playing out in the future? Do you see that these pro-trade business interests might be a stabilizing factor, let's say?
I do think
forward?
I hope so. I don't have a crystal ball, but if I think, for example, at this very uncertain and time in which also policies are threatened one day and 70 hours later removed. I think, for example, that turnaround of the Trump administration on this threat of 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. I think if I look, I'm working with other co-authors on a big project on US multinational. If you look at the supply chains of the US multinational, they have subsidiaries in Mexico and Canada, and they're sourcing all their inputs from them. These goods pass the border so many times. So these large US multinational have, I mean, there's anecdotal evidence. I don't have yet the systematic evidence. It will take time for it to arrive in the lobbying reports, but they have in Washington, in K Street, in Congress, started to say, are you crazy? No, we are either assembling or sourcing inputs from these subsidiaries. So this is complete suicide. And I think, my understanding is that this was one of the possible reasons why these policies were not put in place. There were companies who pushed very hard against them. Understandably, the North American market is a factory, North American factory, as Richard Baldwin calls it, and because of NAFTA and because of proximity, gravity, and rules of origin, all sorts of reasons, but it is extremely integrated. So companies were pushed very much against these measures, and that's probably one of the reasons why they are not there. But let's see. I don't have a crystal ball, but I can, if you see companies, you see what their stakes are and what their interests are. I think many companies will have an interest in keeping some borders at least open. So
I have a thank you. Also, I think very interesting perspective. So, and we're almost out of time already. I don't know how this happened. It's such an interesting discussion. But let me ask you one last question that comes from the audience, which I also thought was really interesting. There's a lot of talk lately about environmentally motivated trade policy measures, such as carbon border adjustments. The United Kingdom, I believe, has also announced that they're introducing something like that. How do you think of the political economy of that?
I don't know enough. I think this is something, by the way, I'm coming to Geneva soon. We should have a debate because I'm very interested in what you're doing at the WTO on the impact of trade on the environment. And I think, a lot of these policies have been, I don't know enough. So but I'm interested in, and I think it's going to play out both in Brussels, in Geneva, and in Washington. One thing I want to say, by the way, because you said we talked about a lot the US, and indeed, a lot of my work, not all by any means, is focused on the US, but this is partly because of data availability. If you want to study political economy, I can tell you in Brussels, it's full of lobbies. I know many people who work for lobbies, and you walk around, there are lobbies everywhere, but there's no data. The US is really a gold mine if you want to study how political factors, if you wanted, for example, to look at CBAN or like political economy in Brussels, is much harder because of lack of data. In Washington, there's like a much more information available, so you can do things more systematically. But I think this is to be continued. So I'll come and knock on your office.
No, that would be great. Let's continue the conversation. So we're already 1 minute over time, and I'm a German living in Switzerland, so this makes me very nervous.
Thank you so much, Ralph, for agreeing to doing this.
Yeah, thank you, Paola. It was a really interesting presentation, and thanks Oxford for organizing this.
Ciao, Ralph. Bye.
Ciao.